All right, so for this next section, we're in 2nd Nephi chapter 9. Again, we have Jacob speaking, and he is teaching us about the atonement in relationship to the fall. And so, in regards to the questions, there's a couple of questions here, but what I'm going to spend the most of the time talking about is the activity that is presented in this section. And the activity is this, that as we are reading 2nd Nephi chapter 9 verses 1 through 26, to consider marking in one color what would happen to us without the atonement of Jesus Christ, then in another color you would mark what we can receive through the Savior's atonement or through the atonement of Jesus Christ. And it's an interesting little study. As you can see, I've got here two colors, orange and pink. And so pink is what would be with the atonement, and the orange would be what would happen without the atonement. And so I think what was the most interesting thing about this study, I said this a couple of times in doing these come follow me activities and studies and answering these questions, it causes you to read the scriptures differently. And I found that to be the case today. When I considered how I would have answered that question before doing this study, it's very different than how I'm going to answer the question doing the study, and that'll make a little bit more sense as we get going. So the majority of this reading is the first section. The first half of it is really focused of the without the atonement, and then the next half is more focused on with the atonement. And so I'm going to jump in and I'm just going to read some of these phrases. And so let me just ask that question one more time. What would happen to us? What would happen to mankind without the atonement of Jesus Christ? Let's look to see what Jacob teaches us in this reading. Verse 4, we would waste away and die. 5, he suffereth himself to become subject unto man in the flesh. I just kind of hit me in a different way, that we're subject to the flesh. We're subject to the weaknesses of the flesh. The natural man is an enemy to God. Verse 6, they were cut off from the presence of the Lord. Without the atonement of Jesus Christ, we would be cut off permanently from the presence of the Lord. Corruption could not put on incorruption, so we would be doomed to corruption. The first judgment, we're in verse 7, the first judgment which came upon man must needs have remained to an endless duration. So essentially we would be in a state of sin or corruption for an endless time period without the atonement. Flesh must have laid down to rot and to crumble in its mother earth to rise no more. So understand that without the atonement, there is no resurrection. When we die, we are in a permanent state of death. Our bodies it gets very graphic here, rot and crumble. The spirits must become subject to the angel who fell from before the presence of the eternal God and became the devil to rise no more. So here we're talking about Lucifer, of course, Satan, the devil. Our spirits are subject to the devil. Our spirits must have become like unto him. That's a scary reality, that our spirits will be forever without a body, miserable like unto the devil. And then in verse 9 it continues, we become devils, angels to the devil, to be shut out from the presence of our God, remain with the fathers of lies in misery. So remember when we were talking about agency and accepting Jesus Christ, miserable is a word that I love to discuss when referring to sin. Death of the body, death of the spirit. Those are some of the things that are inevitable if there were no atonement of Jesus Christ. But let's end with the good news, right? The message of the gospel of Jesus Christ is also known as the good news. And so the good news is that the Savior did come and that he did die, and he died according to God's will to be able to lift us up and to be able to suffer so that we would not need to suffer. So that would be without. Now let's go to what we can receive through the Savior's atonement. Jump ahead to verse 12, about about halfway through the verse. The bodies and the spirits of men will be restored one to another, and it is by the power of the resurrection of the Holy One of Israel. So now we're changing this corruption. We're now talking about incorruption. We're talking about the restoration of our body and spirit to be reunited together as a resurrected body forever. Jump into verse 13. The spirit and the body is restored to itself again, restating what we said before. All men become incorruptible and immortal, and they are living souls. So now we're talking about an eternity with God, an eternity of incorruption, immortality, and going on living as living souls. Our knowledge shall be perfect, a perfect knowledge of all of our guilt and our uncleanliness, our nakedness, and the righteous shall have a perfect knowledge of their enjoyment and their righteousness, being clothed with purity, yea, even with the robe of righteousness. So that you get a little bit of differentiation in that verse, but we see here as Jacob is showing kind of the black and white of with the atonement, without the atonement. You'll see here without the atonement, guilt, uncleanliness, nakedness. But on the other hand, with the atonement, perfect knowledge of their enjoyment, their righteousness, being clothed with purity, yea, even with the robe of righteousness. Again in verse 15, they have become immortal. And then at the end, being judged according to the holy judgment of God. I guess it's fun to do some of these studies to be able to see just how clear we can answer some of these questions of the soul. What is the purpose of the atonement? Where would we be without the atonement? What other answers have you found in this reading? Share them below in the comments.